The last 3 videos I made on this channel were about 3 specific games. This topic is going to be a little more nebulous, a little more abstract, so bear with me. See, I've recently developed some strong feelings about the term indie game. And it all started when I was working on a script for another video where I posed the question, is Lies of P an indie game? The answer, yes, no, it's a little more complicated than that. So what the heck even is an indie game? If you Google the definition of an indie game, you get an indie game, short for independent video game, is a video game created by individuals or smaller development teams without the financial and technical support of a large game publisher, in contrast to most AAA games. Let's break that down. A video game created by individuals or smaller development teams. So how do we identify a small development team? Is that one person, 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people? Where's the line? On Steam, there's a game called Sifu, a game that is tagged as an indie game. Now, if I remember correctly, tags are chosen by players in the community and not by the actual developers themselves. Just wanted to throw that out there. Sifu is tagged as an indie game despite having been developed by 80 people at a company called Slowclap, and it was published by a company called Kepler Interactive, which is a company with over 200 employees. Is that indie? Or what about a game like Hades? Supergiant Games is a team of 12 employees. That sounds really indie. And they publish the game digitally on their own. That sounds super indie. But pump the brakes. Retail copies were published and distributed by a company called Private Division, which in and of itself has a little over 100 employees. And to double down, Private Division is owned by Take-Two Interactive, a multi-billion-dollar games holding company. Does that make them any more or less indie? Hades being developed by a small team but semi-published by a large publisher leads us to our next topic. Without the financial and technical support of a large game publisher, in contrast to most AAA games. Let's take a look at Team 17. They published the super awesome, really cool, absolutely wonderful indie game called Dredge, developed by 4 people. I mean, that's about as indie as it gets. Except Team 17 is a publicly traded company with about 400 employees and 6 subsidiaries. About as not indie as you can get. Or what about Dave the Diver, which controversially took home the Best Indie Game Award at last year's Game Awards, despite Mint Rocket, the team that developed them, being a small team within Nexon, a multi-billion-dollar games company out of Korea. I think we should look at Stardew Valley. I think it's one of the best examples of an indie game that saw incredible commercial success. All developed by one guy, published by a relatively small publishing studio, which doesn't even have publishing rights anymore. Except there's one small caveat. See, the retail copies of the game for PlayStation and Xbox, including some collector's editions, was distributed by 505 Games. 505 Games is a video game publishing company with about 100 employees, owned by Digital Bros, an even larger video game publishing company, publicly traded on the Italian stock market, making millions of dollars a year, and has a little over 450 employees, before crazy layoffs this year that cut 30% of their global workforce. So is Stardew still indie? I mean, does it even matter? What about a game's vibe? Can a game feel indie? I've had conversations with friends who genuinely feel games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Helldivers 2 are indie games, simply based on the fact that the developers are a passionate bunch, and that it doesn't matter how many people are on the team, or how much money Sony gives Arrowhead, or how massive Larian Studios really is. And while I can respect that sentiment, and to some degree relate to that feeling, how do you measure vibes or passion? How do you measure the heart and soul put into a video game? See, I would argue that the devs, artists, and writers that worked on the original Assassin's Creed games pumped their heart and soul into those games. But that doesn't make me think that Ubisoft is an indie company. Despite the fact that they are independent, they don't have a large studio looming over their heads, and they have complete creative control over what they make. Wait a minute, is Ubisoft the most indie company this entire time? Despite the given definition, I'm still unsure what qualifies as an indie game these days. See, the developer and publisher relationship has changed so much in just the last 20 years that an indie game today would most certainly not be considered an indie game 20 years ago. I was talking to some friends on Dryden Thomas's Discord. He's the developer of Lighthoof and Disinherited. I'm going to link his channel below and you should definitely check out his stuff. And I was asking them about what they thought indie even meant. Dryden himself had a really interesting thing to say about this. He said, in my opinion, something similar is happening in the gaming space that happened in music maybe 20 years ago, where indie music used to mean financially independent, like not attached to a record deal. But indie had a sound, and that sound got popular, and it started being published by major labels, and then indie was more of a quasi-genre, like a way to sing and produce and do instrumentation. And then, ultimately, it was another marketing category. And this makes perfect sense. See, indie has gone from an actual identifier of the type of game you were going to buy to a buzzword used by gaming marketers to evoke a sense of grassrootedness, the old 2 guys in a garage with some duct tape. Sure, we have our Eric Baronis of the world, but sometimes even they are connected to large gaming companies one way or another. I want to pump the brakes real quick. I need to clarify something. There is nothing wrong. I am not casting any shade to Eric Baroni for turning to 505 games for physical distribution or Chucklefish for porting. These are among some of likely the best business decisions that Eric Baroni and his team made. There is nothing wrong with a small team of devs or a solo developer turning to a large publisher, a porter, or a large dev team for help, financial assistance, technical assistance. There's nothing wrong with that. These are all just business decisions. Decisions that ultimately individuals and small groups decide is the best decision and route for their game to become a financial success. There's simply nothing wrong with not being traditionally indie. I mean, heck, we're even talking about how indie doesn't even really mean anything anyway, but you can break from that traditional route and do whatever makes sense for your game. And by the way, there's also nothing inherently wrong or good about going solo. It's really up to you and the individual and what you need the most for your project. When you look at it, these are just key business decisions that one should make when marketing or creating anything. And this, my friends, leads us to the crux of my argument. Indie, it doesn't mean anything at all. Indie is an archaic term that does less to actually describe a video game you're making or buying than a goldfish can do choosing your stocks and actually making you money. I already pointed out to you how identifying what an indie game even is today is near impossible. And with how simple it is to publish on sites like itch.io and Steam, and the relationship between publishers and developers becoming even more complex, indie doesn't really do much to sum up what a game is or how it came to be anymore. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not even a feeling anymore. Sure, your game can be lo-fi like Dave the Diver or have that indie aesthetic like Dredge. But in the end, indie is just a term that doesn't really cut it anymore. And nowadays we're better off with more descriptive terms like solo game dev or small development team or self-published. Indie can incorporate those things, but it can't all at the same time. I think it's high time we say goodbye to using indie as a way to describe video games and move on to greener pastures. Or at the very least, just don't take it as seriously as some people do, because I mean, at the end of the day, video games are just supposed to be fun. Isn't that the point? That all being said, this is an incredibly difficult topic to cover. I did a bunch of research, interviewed a bunch of people, but at the end of the day, everything is so subjective. And I definitely didn't cover all of the use cases of indie, and I don't think I could in one video, because it's just been such a prolific piece of gaming vocabulary for longer than I've been alive. Not to mention, most of these arguments are super subjective in and of themselves. Listen, I've probably ruffled some feathers with you diehard indie fans out there, but the term indie has just become so muddy and confusing as an actual term used in the gaming industry, and I feel like it's just run its course. That I personally feel just isn't as useful as it once was. What do you guys think? Do you think that indie is still a useful term in the gaming industry at all, or should we move on to terms like AA games, whatever that even means? Let me know in the comments below. And I just want to say, sorry this took so long to come out. I got sick. Shadow of the Erdtree came out and played and beat that. Started playing Nine Souls recently. Still have a little residual cough, so excuses, but I'm going to try to make more of these, and who knows? Maybe the next video will be about... Anyway, thanks for watching, and catch you next time.